Hey, what's up, everybody? This week on the Built on Purpose podcast, I'm going to cover 4 relevant topics. The first one is the death of job boards and what it means for companies and candidates. The second one is something that's near and dear to my heart, something that I'm running into left and right. I thought I might share my perspective on it. Maybe it'll help you, or I would assume it'd help you. And it is the topic around being over-reliant on assessments for hiring and AI's impact on assessments. We run into a lot of situations where I'm seeing companies far too reliant on using assessments to basically negate or green light or red light people very early on in the hiring process, which I would not recommend. So I want to kind of cover how we look at it, how people are misusing it, and how to use it properly, what assessments are should be used for. And I'm going to cover a couple of those topics. And then third, I'm going to talk about purpose. This is the Built on Purpose podcast. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Dan Sullivan's 4 Freedoms of Entrepreneurs. It's in the book, Who Not How. So I'm going to cover a little bit of that, as I think it's an interesting way to talk about purpose and where purpose comes in, especially for entrepreneurs in business. And then the last one is just communication, some basic information around effective communication. I think effective communication is the domino that can make you better in every element of your life. So let's start with the death of job boards and the future of hiring, and specifically executive hiring. This week was a big week. We got the news that CareerBuilder and Monster, 2 of the largest job boards in the world, filed for bankruptcy. This has been a long thing coming. If you know anything about Yscouts and the brand, and what we've passionately been doing here is our purpose is to transform how people and companies connect work that matters. And back when we started this company in 2012, we were very passionate that job boards were one of the reasons why hiring processes were broken for many, many years. And it's just now coming to a head. I am a little giddy with this because I have been always selling to people and training people around using job boards and how they're being misused and how they're just turning a lot of hiring processes and situations into very poor situations. You know, everybody knows their story about posting a job, having the candidate rewrite their resume, and then that candidate coming in and basically gamifying the interview process, lying in the interview, getting the job, and then they can't do anything that they said they could do. And then you have to lay them off. And in the end, the hiring manager is the bad person because you're laying a person off of work, when really the process had to do with the job board at first and then hiring process. Those were the people guilty of that problem of hiring the wrong person that couldn't do what they said they could do. So this weekend, getting this news about CareerBuilder and Monster, man, I'm telling you, this has been a long time coming. I mean, I think AI was finally the thing that pushed this over the top. But for many years, traditional job boards were built for volume, not fit. And in this day and age, we need fit, particularly soft skill fit. And job boards are not good with soft skill fit. And even furthermore, they really made the problem worse of people being able to apply to really hundreds of jobs within just a matter of minutes, and not even thinking through what they're applying to, making it very difficult for hiring managers, especially people in talent acquisition, to source through those resumes and find out who's who and whose information is actually accurate and whose isn't. I mean, we have a big enough problem as it is with over 60% of people that have inaccurate resumes. Now you're putting a job board out there, or these job boards that were allowing people to build a resume or build an application from scratch and basically fabricate and generate a lot of information that was inaccurate. Now, I'm not bad talking everybody. There are some honest people still out there that were using job boards. So for those people, I'm sorry it has started to come to an end. There are still job boards out there, obviously, Indeed. And I think LinkedIn does a decent job in kind of how they go about it. And I do think that there is a time and place for job boards. You know, maybe some lower level roles where, you know, you do need a volume of people. You set up a process where that's the first, obviously, the input that you're getting people's information. But even then, I don't think it is the best way or the right way. And I'll talk about why. You know, I think posting and praying for the right person to apply for a job is like throwing spaghetti against the wall and, you know, expecting a Michelin-starred chef to walk by and pick it up at the same time. That's about the odds that we're talking about. So let's talk about what we can do instead. And there are a lot of AI tools. I'll get into that a little bit. I can get into it on further episodes as well, that are helping us on the hiring side of being able to source great candidates and really reach out to candidates in a much more intentional way that, quite frankly, feels a lot better to candidates anyway. So, you know, the first thing I kind of talk about is we need to go to shifting hiring to a more high trust, high touch, strategic kind of search and internal like mobility kind of process versus a high volume and transactional process, which when you post a job, you're basically saying like everybody throw their resumes in a pile and we'll search through them. And clearly that doesn't work because everybody just rewrites their resume. Anybody that can touch a keyboard at this day and age knows how to rewrite their resume with AI. So I think that was the final block that pushed it over the top. And now we have both CareerBuilder and Monster filing for bankruptcy. So what I would talk about, what you should do instead. Now, I've talked about this a lot, so I apologize if you know about Yscouts and you've heard our differentiating factors. This is very basic stuff. But for those of you that don't and are kind of looking at this, maybe this problem for the first time or having to deal with this problem for the first time, I would say first and foremost, you need to get clear on the role before you hire. I know that's very obvious, but every single time we take on a role, we need to get out what the company really needs out of the leaders' heads. A lot of times they don't even know what's in their head, but they have enough information that you got to get all out on paper and sort through it and really figuring out what this person needs to achieve to be successful in the role. And it be very detailed and very specific for an actual company, whatever your company you work for, whatever you're doing this for, if you're on the talent acquisition side, and get really specific on what the person needs to achieve, particularly in the first 6 to 12 months. I know that sounds like a short window, but you have to understand what the company needs to achieve to be successful and the role that this person will play in this success. And so you'll go through that. It's literally a process of concentrating down what the most important thing that this person does. The best way it's achieved if you have multiple inputs or multiple stakeholders and they are answering questions separately, or at least, you can like jot, if you don't use our tool, we have a tool called Role Visioning. It's at rolevisioning.com. And I'm not selling that to you, but it is a great resource to define roles. But what that basically does that allow you to do this on your own is each individual stakeholder, the person that understands the strategy of the role, it could even be people that are in the role, people that this role reports to, and people on the leadership team, maybe somebody in HR would also have a good perspective, but you get their perspective individually, trying to answer the question, what are the 3 most important things this person needs to achieve to be successful in the role? What are the corresponding key responsibilities for those 3 success outcomes? And so you get alignment with the people that understand the strategy of the role best. We call it a multi-stakeholder approach. And the reason why I point this out is the opposite of a multi-stakeholder approach is having one person go through a process where like maybe AI writes them a job description, or maybe they go copy a job description from a job board that's not bankrupt. So that's kind of what the process looks like. There's more questions. Our book, Hiring on Purpose, covers this. It actually has questions for a role visioning exercise. I won't go in all of them because I think you can understand the basic framework is you got to get multiple people's input individually and then combine that input in order to concentrate down the most important things this person achieves to be successful. The corresponding key responsibilities and kind of the advanced question that you need to answer is, how are we going to measure it? So how is this person going to know when they're successful? We need to set these people up for success, whether they be leaders or individual contributors. So we need to understand what metrics are going to drive success in this role and be very upfront and start interviewing people to make sure that they can achieve those metrics, or they have some background or experience in being able to achieve the most important success outcomes and those key responsibilities. And then you can focus your interviews more on those things. In addition, though, the one thing that I'm not talking about that is also very important, and I'd say half the puzzle, is also figuring out soft skill alignment. So really understanding your culture at a deeper level. We do what's called an org DNA. They're just basic, deeper questions about what makes our culture unique. Really understanding that at a deeper level. Maybe you have values, so you want to interview around values. So tell me about a time when, so you understand when this person can point out specific behaviors when they are exemplified the values that are most important to your company. Maybe you're a remote culture. So that's part of a culture, based questions. You want to find out if somebody's going to be able to be successful in a remote environment. And I'm here to tell you that, quite honestly, most people are not set up and not necessarily capable to be effective in a remote culture. Although they think they are, they enjoy the freedom and the flexibility. People need a little bit more guidance. So anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but you definitely want to ask questions around work style and make sure, if I'm hiring a leader, we always want to make sure that somebody's been able to be successful in a similar situation before. So if it's a remote role, then, I want to make sure that they can be successful with, being kind of on their own and not needing a ton of guidance 24/7 in their role. 24/7 might be a little exaggeration, but you know what I mean. So as far as that goes, so you get clear on what success looks like in the role, kind of back to what we are doing and what you should be doing as far as not using job boards and not posting jobs. And if you are going to post jobs, after you get clear on what success looks like in the role and you understand the specifics around the success outcomes and key responsibilities and how you're going to measure it, like the actual metrics that this person's going to know if they're successful, then if you have to post it, just post it with very generic information about like maybe the role title if you have to, and then maybe some generics around the success outcomes, but don't get into the specifics around the key responsibilities or, the metrics that you're using to measure it. And or we always build what's called an ideal candidate profile. So that's the actual ideal candidate, like their experience, maybe their schooling, their training, like all those things. That's something that you don't want to put out into the universe. That's something that you want to keep close to your vest and you want to interview to once the person gets in front of you and actually build a little bit of rapport and start truly interviewing them to make sure that they can achieve the success outcomes, key responsibilities, and they're aligned to the soft skills of the role. So once you get clear on what success looks like in the role, the interviewing process is all about interviewing and vetting. Like people are thinking that AI and posting jobs and all these different gadgets and tools are going to be something that replaces good interviewing process, good interview questions, and they are not. So you want to build a good interview guide based off of the success outcomes, key responsibilities, and you also want to make sure to ask good questions and vet for experience. Ask the same questions when you're comparing candidates so you compare their answers. And then I'd also say, you have to build your employer brand. In this day and age, you can't post jobs and just pray that people are going to come, to your business. If you want to do that, you're rolling the dice. So top tier candidates are vetting you just as much as you're vetting them. So in building your employment brand, the good news is it's kind of the same thing as building your brand in general. Like in this day and age, everything's so transparent with social media and, all the different platforms out there, that you have to build a good brand. You have to be very intentional about the type of people that you want on your team, the type of people that are successful, and continue to put out the appropriate information that, quite frankly, is going to repel some people and it's going to attract the right people. One thing that I would bring up in this point about building your employer brand is, while it may sound like it takes a lot of time to start attracting or reaching out to people that you potentially want on your team, or reaching out to your teammates that can refer other people that they think are a good fit for your team, and start actually building relationships with those people. And it doesn't mean you have to reach out and talk to every single one of them. It may just mean that you need to build a campaign exactly for candidates that you want to stay in touch with, that you want to let them know more information about what's going on at your business, and obviously, about particular roles that are coming out, and starting with them. I had a podcast, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, is an episode with Chris Ronzio from Traineel. And he talked a lot about how that's how they do almost all of their hiring. And they have a very intentional culture, meaning they ask for referrals. They get those people, they reach out to them, they get to know them a little bit and spend that time. Now you can do it that way, or you can post jobs if you're going to go that direction and go take hours and hours with a bunch of people that aren't even close to being a fit. I'd rather start with the people that actually want to be there and start vetting through them. But there you have it. This week, CareerBuilder, Monster, they filed bankruptcy, and really everything that we've been building and selling against, posting jobs and all that rhetoric, is now coming to an end or coming to a head with AI. The hiring game's changed. So if you're still using yesterday's tools, don't be surprised when you get yesterday's results. The fall of CareerBuilder and Monster also isn't the end. In fact, for us, it's always been the beginning. Like, we started this in 2012 and kind of knew that job posting was never going to be the solution. It's the beginning of a smarter, more intentional way to hire. So look at it from that perspective. And then if you want more information, I've barely scratched the surface on role visioning and success outcome design. Obviously, feel free to reach out to Yscouts if you're hiring for a critical role and it's so critical that it is going to make or break your business. Then reach out to us and we can help you. We can help you hire that. And then we also have a role visioning tool at revolutionize.com that is just getting underway. But if you want to be one of the first adopters to go use it, you can. It basically does exactly what I described. A user will go on there and basically talk to our AI bot, Scout, and Scout will ask you questions about the role and get a good perspective of what the role is. And then you can also put in other people's names. It'll send the same tool to multiple people, and then it'll combine what they say to a clear, what we call opportunity profile, or what you might call a job description, but it is a very fast way. It's under 10 minutes for each user. So take a look at that. Now, the second topic that I want to cover here is the over-reliancy of assessments in hiring selection. And I want to pick on particularly the TASE. Not that the TASE is one of many. It's very good in different situations. But what people are doing, especially when we're the one doing their sourcing and finding their employees, is they're getting so over-reliant on assessments that were never made for selection. And again, I'll use TASE as an example. TASE stands for the attention and interpersonal style. It's one of many, many assessments. We use assessments as well, which I can get into. We use TTI. We understand predictive index. I mean, they're all great tools, but you got to take them and use them for the right reasons. In fact, I think the people that are over-reliant on assessments, they have their heart in the right place and they're thinking about this the right ways. They don't want to make hiring mistakes. I get it, but what you're kind of doing is you're creating such a small pool of candidates that you're missing out on finding actually good individuals that can effectively achieve success in your role, probably very, aligned to your culture, and ones that can actually perform in the role well, because you're taking an assessment and you're throwing them all out and you're giving yourself a very small pool to fish from. And all it does is delay hiring more than it should be. Honestly, in some cases, I think they're very biased, like on how somebody answers that. So if you're using it as a first step, it was never intended to be used for that. I also think it's the same reason, in my opinion, when you have good hiring process, especially if you hire a firm, you need to help that firm use that firm's process. If you've chosen the right firm, like our process, it helps you figure out and vet people. We're very good at interviewing. We're very good at defining success in their goal. We're very good at understanding the soft skills. So you need to do the same thing. And I think what I see people also do is they get over-reliant on assessments and over-reliant on projects and presentations, like as a last step. Now, we encourage presentations as a last step, but there's a difference between a presentation where there's like a couple hours, 2-3 hours of research, and then you come in and you present so you can, see how the person thinks, then using a long project where you're probably going to lose the best candidate because somebody else, a competitor, has a better interview process. So I think a lot of times people are using assessments and projects as a fix for bad interview process. So don't let that be you, but let's go back to the assessments problem. Assessments are great, like I said. My opinion is AI is so good with assessments. If you haven't messed around with AI and assessments, go ask AI, give it like one of your assessment scores from like a TTI or a predictive index or cultural index, and tell them what you are, what your style is. And it will tell you what your style is in a lot of other assessments. Now, they measure different things, so it won't be 100%, but close enough. You'll be absolutely astonished on how much AI knows about every assessment. If you go ask AI, like, what's the right Colby score for this job? And then you have like a job description or something, it'll kick it out in like 2 seconds. I mean, it'll actually tell you why. And I'm not suggesting using Colby for hiring, for selection as well, but I'm just saying that AI is changing the games for assessments. So if you're using assessments, maybe think through using a tool like generated by AI that's really looking like more specifically at the role, at the company, all the things that are important. All right, going back to TASE, for example, this was developed for leadership development and coaching. It was not ever intended for selection to start. It's also for team dynamics, communications mapping, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, like how one's natural tendencies and blind spots are in focus, and then in decision-making and interpersonal engagement. It also is good for stress performance readiness and succession planning, really figuring out, you can spot internal talent with leadership potential, and bringing them up through the ranks. And like TASE and many others, what it's not good for is candidate elimination and early stage screening. And that's where I'm seeing people misuse it. They're making pass-fail hiring decisions based on it. It lacks job-specific validation in many business contexts, and it provides psychological insights, but not competency verification or cultural alignment analysis. That's what you're going to have to do. In fact, that's what you have to do first in order to move them through the process. And if somebody has been successful in achieving the same types of tasks and success outcomes and key responsibilities in another role, you should probably pay more attention, maybe use this as a second step to really identify, kind of it as an onboarding and communication styles. People are replacing interviews and references and doing all this stuff. All the stuff that you need to do intentionally in the internal hiring process are being skipped because people are just throwing out the baby with the bathwater with assessments. So the other thing, it doesn't evaluate technical or functional skills. Again, you got to do an interview and figure out what this person needs to achieve. And then, the kind of the key principles for some of these assessments, and again, I'm focusing on TASE in particular, is that it's more of a flashlight, not a filter. And so as soon as you use it as a filter, then you're misusing it. You need to use it as a flashlight to illuminate how somebody thinks and interacts, but it shouldn't be used to determine whether they should be hired. It's best reserved for supporting, not leading the hiring decision. So that's assessments. Again, I've been seeing so much of this that I wanted to kind of share my mind. And if you're fallen, kind of victim to this, or you're overusing it, you're not getting your jobs filled, you're not seeing people that are passing your assessments or a perfect fit, then you need to kind of reconsider. We think of assessments, at least in our model, because we're hiring leaders that have proven backgrounds and exactly what we need them to do that also align to the soft skills. But we use it as about 10 to 15% of the hiring picture, and certainly not as the first step later on in the process. And for us, it's more about when we're comparing candidates in particular, we do want to know how they're most naturally wired in order to perform in the role. So that stuff does matter, but when you're overusing it and over-indexing it, it's not a good situation, and you'll basically slow your hiring process to a halt. And then when there is a great candidate, you probably miss them because you're over-relying on it. That's my take on assessments. And like I said, AI is going to change assessments forever. It already knows the background of every assessment. If you ask AI, if you're a promoter in predictive index, if you ask it what a promoter does, what it looks like at a Colby score, it'll tell you a Colby score that's pretty almost accurate to like what yours will be. So it knows there's a lot of AI tools that we'll see that I think will replace assessments and make it a lot smoother hiring process and kind of rely on them the correct way versus being over reliant on them. So that's my take on hiring assessments. Now I want to get into who, not how. I actually got to admit, I can't believe I didn't read this book sooner. Dan Sullivan is in Genius Network. I see him pretty frequently. And so I'm going to walk through some of the concepts from the book. If you've read the book, great. I think these will resonate with you. But this relates to kind of how we think through things. I'm also an entrepreneur, so it really resonates with me. I think most people get stuck asking, like, how do I do this? And I think every entrepreneur knows that you can only do that when, so much when you're an entrepreneur until you have to like find other people that can do other things better and replace some of the stuff that you're doing. But the better question is, who can do this for me? And who would be better suited for doing this for me? I think every entrepreneur runs into the first, trap of time is limited, expertise is distributed. The fastest pace to success isn't do it yourself. It's leveraging the right who. So how puts you in the problem solving mode and bottleneck mode? Who puts you in the expansion and collaboration mode? In order to build a great business, you must hire the right people, get the right leaders, and get them on board and find the right who's. And the great example that they use in Who Not How, I think this is an incredible one, although I am a former jock and sports junkie. Michael Jordan, arguably the best player of any sport in the world. I'd argue he is the best player for a lot of reasons. He had a lot stiffer competition. They actually played defense back then. A bunch of reasons that we could argue why Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James, but I would say Michael Jordan all the way. But okay, let's start with Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was the best player in the world, but couldn't win championships solo. That was the problem with the Chicago Bulls. But he was smart enough to know that he needed the right who. So the right who's they brought on board, if you think back to the Michael Jordan era, was Scottie Pippen. He was the ultimate number two and took all the pressure off Michael Jordan. He played great defense. He could shoot the ball. He could do it all. Scottie Pippen would have been the number one on probably almost every team, but knew his role because he also wanted to win games. So they get Scottie Pippen on board. They start to win a little bit more. Michael Jordan's not triple teamed anymore. And then they figure out, all right, now we need the right who for a coach. So they bring in Phil Jackson, and he brought in the triangle offense and the team's first kind of mindset. And Phil Jackson is the Zen. He's one of the best. And I'm not even a Chicago Bulls fan, by the way. So this is somebody that a basketball fan and sports fan. And then they keep going through this process of who. Michael Jordan starts figuring out who he needs a performance coach. So those of you familiar with Tim Grover, amazing follow, has done some amazing work, also coached Kobe Bryant, or also had Kobe Bryant as a client. So Tim was able to, he's a performance coach. He pushed Michael Jordan to physical and mental limits. And so that's how they won games. They started to think about who, not how. None of these were how solutions. They were strategic who's that elevated the team. Without these who's, MJ would just be remembered as the greatest scorer, not the greatest winner. Michael Jordan won 6 championships, unbelievable in a short period of time, and then hung it up as the greatest basketball player of all time. We see LeBron James kind of hanging in there and not hanging it up. And I like LeBron James too. I just think it's time for him to retire. So let's talk about other compelling examples of who, not how. So if you're not convinced that Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and Phil Jackson and Tim Grover, that combination, let's take Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a visionary, but probably not the best operator, but definitely the best visionary. I was listening to a podcast today and they're talking about Steve Jobs. Man, what a visionary he was. So the who that he found that built the first Apple computers was Steve Wozniak. So without Steve Wozniak, Jobs would have been probably somebody we would have known about, but never would have Apple been as dominant as they are. And then the other who that they brought in was Tim Cook. He was the who that scaled the company through logistics and operations mastery. So I'm giving you some more who, not how. So if you're building a business, think about who and not how. Jobs' genius was in recruiting and trusting his who's, and he was really good at finding who's, and so was Steve, and so was Tim, and so that's how that goes. And then let's move on to Elon Musk. He was another example that I was thinking about, known for SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, but doesn't personally write code or design rockets. Obviously, this guy knows how to hire the right who's. His gift is assembling world-class who's, engineers, technologists, operators, and pulling it off. Yeah, he is a hard charger. He is relentless at knowing what's signal and what's noise. He knows what's signal and he stays so on the signal. In fact, I think he's probably too wired to only seeing signal. I don't even think that guy likes to probably interact and socialize because he is so focused on signal and not noise, which most entrepreneurs' problem is like they can't distinguish noise from signal. Elon Musk's problem probably is like he can't deal with noise because all he wants to do is signal. So I think most of us are jealous in some ways and then not in others, because I think he has a hard time socializing. But he does know how to hire who's, and he does know how to locate the who's. So, for example, when Shotwell runs SpaceX day to day, that's a who. Elon provides the mission, and they relentlessly go after it. So I'm going to give you one other example, and then I want to talk about another framework, the 4 freedoms of entrepreneurs. Again, this is from Who Not How, and it's Dan Sullivan's The 4 Freedoms of Entrepreneurs. But if you think about Tom Brady, again, I'm a sports fan, so sorry if you guys are not sports fans. But, Brady was brilliant on the field, but always had elite offensive lines, top tier coaches. Belichick, Arians was offensive coordinator, and people like Alex Guerrero, his body coach and health guru. If you know anything about Tom Brady, he did an exceptional job of staying fit and staying physically fit and mentally fit all the time. His who's extended his prime well into his 40s because he did such a good job of surrounding himself with the right people. All right, so I'm going to get off the who's, not how's. I think you probably understand the concept that you can't win alone, and the only way to expand time and scale your business is through finding the right who's. All right, I want to get into the 4 freedoms of entrepreneurs. This, again, isn't who, not how, so feel free to pick it up and read it. I just thought when I read this for the first time recently, which is crazy that I haven't read this until recently, it really blew my mind how accurate this is. And the order, I think, is correct. And that's coming from me that runs a purpose-based, or we that run a purpose-based leadership search firm. So the first thing is the freedom of time. Time is the ultimate entrepreneurial currency. Everybody knows that. An entrepreneur starts their business and their first thing they need to do is figure out how do they replace themselves so they're not doing everything. So time, again, freedom of time is the first thing that most entrepreneurs figure out is their goal. They need to do less personally, but produce more collectively. So they start, hiring people for the most obvious things in EA, and then somebody to run operations and somebody to do sales and marketing. And then, it goes on and on. But they have the concept is like the freedom of time thing is like they can cut their work load in half by delegating the house to other people that are better suited. And expanded time equals expanded vision. So when they can delegate, get the right who's to expand their time, so freedom of time, they can then expand their vision because they can focus more on vision. Where are we going? And being very clear with the people that are the right who's. So that's the first freedom, is the freedom of time. And then comes the freedom of money. So money isn't just a lifestyle. It's for capability. It allows you to buy back your time. If you've ever read Dan Martell's book, also a good book, to invest in better who's and move faster. Anybody that's been successful, yeah, they get to a point where you could continue to make money in your business model by yourself, but it doesn't work. You don't want to do that. You need to invest in the right who's. So freedom of money becomes important, because then when you have enough time, then you have enough money, then you have those two things knocked out. And these are actually, in my opinion, in the right order as well. As an entrepreneur, I've built businesses and sold businesses. So, entrepreneurs use money to leverage their time, not just stack their dollars. I guess some of them do, but I think a true entrepreneur is always going to be chomping at the bit to figure out they're going to want to continue to build, because it's fun. They enjoy the journey, not the destination. So if you're short on time, look how you're spending your money and your time. So it's a combo of both. So those two things, those are the first two freedoms. And then the third freedom is freedom of relationships. I think this is a huge one. I still go through this quite a bit, actually. As entrepreneurs grow and businesses grow, they become more selective in who they spend their time with. Great relationships give energy, spark ideas, and elevate performance. If you ask any great entrepreneur who they spend their most time with, they spend it with other successful entrepreneurs that are probably pushing the envelope, that they're learning from and getting them to continue to grow. That's why people, that's why I'm in YPO. That's why I was in EO for 10 years. That's why I've been in YPO for the last 12. So getting the right people around you, this allows entrepreneurs that can step away and come back refreshed and operate at a higher level. They don't just network, they curate. So if you're not doing this, if you're not figuring out what are the right people that you should be spending your time with, you should definitely start thinking about it. It is one of the things that is the most important, and you will never grow beyond where you're at if you stay stuck with the people that aren't helping you grow. In fact, I heard recently, and this resonated with me, is that, and I think it was, I'll think of it. I always like to give credit where credit's due. So I think it's so true that people cheer for you pretty much like when you start something and when you finish it. But when you're really in the middle of it and you're in it, it's hard. The people that you kind of typically have around you, if these are the same people, unless they're all entrepreneurs, which usually isn't the case, they're typically only there. They're not there for the hardest time when you need them. So if you surround yourself with people that are also going through hard things and doing hard things, then they will help you elevate your game and help push you and give you, kind of that energy, that positive kind of mindset of continuing to learn, not giving up, like all the things that every entrepreneur needs to do in order to be successful. And this isn't just some entrepreneurs. This is every entrepreneur that I've ever met. These things are the most important. So let me recap just a little bit. We've got freedom of time. So it starts in this order. So you expand that by hiring other people. Then you start making enough money. And then you have the freedom of money. And then you start to realize, now that I have enough money, enough time, I can now find the right resources to spend my time with. And so you start spending your time with the right people and then forming the right relationships. And then sometimes that means also ending relationships that aren't healthy for you, so you can actually have time to spend with the right people. I know a lot of entrepreneurs that are really good at that, about cutting people out of their life. If somebody's not serving you well and you really have, you have you're very motivated to accomplish something, then, the people that aren't supporting it, you may have to think through whether or not they're the people that you want in your life. I know you've heard all this before, but just reiterating. But the fourth freedom for entrepreneurs that Dan Sullivan talks about that I think is genius and probably the most important, but you have to have the first three first, in my opinion, is purpose, the freedom of purpose. Purpose is the flywheel that activates and sustains the other three freedoms. Again, this is taught in Who Not How. So, once time, money, and relationships are optimized, entrepreneurs find clarity on their why. They figure out why they want to do this and why they're doing this. And once they have that, the purpose fuels momentum. It keeps them going when the dollars in the calendars don't. And from here, you build a business life that's driven, not dragged. I don't really believe in a dragged life anyway, so I don't know that term I probably shouldn't use. So those are the four freedoms. And I thought it was interesting because everybody, I think, starts with a purpose. And I think starting with purpose, I think it's a good first step. I'm not going to suggest that, not thinking about what your purpose is and not articulating what your purpose is isn't a good step. I mean, I think that's always a good step, but I think people over rotate on figuring out what their purpose is and trying to figure out like, I love to do this. This is, my why. And then they, kind of start with that and then they don't figure out the other four freedoms of entrepreneurs, which is, freedom of time, freedom of money, freedom of relationships, and freedom of purpose. Purpose is the flywheel. Now you can start with purpose and then figure out the other three. I just think it's a longer road. For what happened with me, it was really this exact order. I didn't figure out what my purpose was until I literally was successfully running a business and we were pretty far down the road. And then I kind of started to try to figure out what was wrong. And what was wrong was I wasn't really into my work. So I had to figure out what was driving me to do the work. And that's when I figured out what my purpose was, which is to help others better succeed in life. It started out as, by the way I got to that was it started out as I was into sports. I was also very into coaching, and coaching came very natural. And so I had to ask myself a lot of questions on why, what my purpose was, which was to help. I believed at the beginning in life, like when I was maybe 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and kind of after college, I thought my purpose was to help others better succeed in sports. And I actually thought I was going to go to work and go run a business and make enough money to where I could go back and work in my purpose. And then it wasn't, I think about 2012, 13, when I realized what my purpose was, when it was a big shift. I know it doesn't sound like it, but to help my personal purpose, I knew it as to help others better succeed in sports. And I kind of one day thought of that and thought, you know what? I think I really just like helping others better succeed because I was doing it in business as well. And so we do that through hiring. Our purpose and our business is to transform how people and companies connect work that matters. And my personal purpose is to better help others better succeed in life. And we do that one placement at a time and helping leaders get unstuck by helping them hire the best leaders on the planet. This isn't a Yscouts commercial, although it's good information to know. And so kind of the last thing I want to wrap up with, by the way, these solo episodes are kind of hard, but also this one's been kind of easy. You just kind of cut loose and get some good topics. These are things that have been kind of on my mind for a while. The last one's about communication. So we had Joel Weldon on our last podcast. Joel is my speaking coach. I think communication is one of the biggest dominoes in life. And not just me. I think most people, if you believe that being able to better communicate can help you across your life, both personally and professionally, then I think we're very, very much aligned. I don't think I've ever heard anybody tell me that it's not, but I'd love to hear the argument and hear somebody contest that. But, first and foremost, one of the things that I just heard the other day, I think on a podcast, was the word communication comes from the root word to make common connection. And that just blew my mind. It also humbly is something that I'm very good at. So that's why it lands with me is I think I'm good at connecting people. I mean, that's what we do. But I think I'm pretty good at communication, and I had to learn how to be better at it in the workplace. In fact, I was a horrible writer when I started my career. And so writing was something that I struggled with, but learned how to do pretty well. And it was, I was a terrible writer, and still I'm not the greatest writer, but now I have tools to help me be a better writer. But going back to communication, the root word, make common connection, I think that is so fitting because I think the best communicators in the world have what's called the reverse charisma. This is a term that I think Stephen Bartlett coined on the Diaries of a CEO, but he talks about how some people are interesting and some people make us feel interesting. And I think we all kind of hear these things, but this one really landed with me is, learning to be interested, not interesting. And I think there's a big difference between the two. I think the people that communicate the best make somebody feel like they're interesting. They make everybody feel like they're interesting. They leave people feeling like they were heard. And there are a lot of communication hacks in order to do this. I think one of my gifts is small talk, actually. If you put me in a room, I think the best communication platform for me is like a happy hour, even though I don't drink that much anymore. But I'm really good at communicating with people and kind of understanding where they're at, maybe recognizing like their name or something that they're wearing and connecting with that, and then kind of making it about them and then getting deeper into the conversation and remembering that you've got to be interested in them in order to have a good conversation, in order for them to leave the conversation feeling like they are interesting. So I think that there are a lot of hacks and tricks to do that. But I think if you just start with that, you're going down the right path. You've probably heard some of this before. I think I just kind of jotted down some notes. I've got some more specific examples of things that you can do. I think one of the problems that I run into, because I'm good at small talk, is when the other thing you got to be good about in communication is ending conversations. So like one of the most basic, I think this is like on Stephen Covey's like 7 Habits book, is the best way to end a conversation is to agree with somebody in what they're saying and then end the conversation. So at least when you kind of cut them off, you're agreeing with something, that they were talking about. So those people that have that problem of ending conversations, I do. A lot of times you don't have to end it so abruptly. You can say, hey, if like you're at a party and you're, talking to somebody or a social event, you can, talk to somebody and say, hey, I have to go talk to another person over here, but can you tell me more about X, Y, and Z, something that you're talking about? So you've already signaled that you're ending the conversation. So then they tell you about the last thing that you asked about. And then again, you leave them feeling like you're interested in them. And that sways the conversation and the communication scales the right direction. I think a lot of people, especially narcissists, they think everybody wants to hear what they're talking about. I have the luxury of having a beautiful wife that reminds me, if I get in the stage of like telling somebody too much information about myself, she'll say, too much information, they don't care. So that's a good signal for me that I have. But again, communication is the biggest domino that can basically help you both, personally and professionally in every aspect of your life. If you want to listen to a podcast on communication, I think Joe Weldon was a great podcast. I think that just went out last Tuesday. So if you want to go listen to that, you can. So let's start pulling this together into an end. So we talked about the death of job boards, CareerBuilder and Monster, file bankruptcy. So finally, hopefully everybody wakes up and starts to understand that posting jobs and like letting tools like basically stack rank resumes that people have fudged is not the best way to hire. And they need to focus on figuring out how to reach out to candidates basically in a proactive and targeted way. And now we can understand people so much better that when you reach out to a candidate and you let them know that you reached out to them because of maybe a company that you respect they work at, and that they have specific experience, and that they live in a certain area, and they have something other on like 4 or 5 different pieces, you reach out to them, and you can do this through a lot of different tools. Then you start building the right type of relationships, and that's how you get A players. That's how you get an A player in a discovery conversation in order to get them into the process. So my recommendation is to figure out ways to customize your targeted reach out and start building actual relationships and not posting jobs. And then we talked about the over-reliancy of assessments for hiring. Assessments, I believe, have a big awakening, which I think is already happening. AI is so good with assessments. My recommendation is if you're so stuck on an assessment using it for hiring, then go figure out your own assessment and have AI help you build one that's specific to your company, like specific to every element of your company, and start using that. It'll build questions for you. They can ask questions. It can show you the results. But again, use it more for awareness and conversation in the interview process. And I think you'll be a lot better suited. And then we talked about purpose. We talked about Dan Sullivan's 4 Freedoms of Entrepreneurs. These are actually amazing. I think most people go searching for their purpose and they miss out on the other 3. And then we talked about communication and some basic information around effective communication. Good communication is the domino for everything else. So that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Built on Purpose podcast, brought to you by Yscouts. You can listen to all of our past and future podcasts at yscouts.com. Thanks for listening.